Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So welcome to today's podcast. Actually, today, my guest, I have been excited to see her, even though I've never met her before. And just to give you a little bit of insight, I get a lot of people wanting to be a guest on my podcast, and I get many, many emails, which I sometimes even can't respond to. But somehow, synchronistically, Sierra's email stood out, and I read it and I went a little bit deeper. And what I found out and the connections we have, I found really interesting and touching. But she will talk about that a little bit more, about who she is. But I'll just give you a little bit of a summary for those who don't know who Sierra is, as I didn't know before I met her. She carries more than 30 years of direct experience in one of the most universally human and universally avoided territories: aging, dying, and the care of those at the end of life. Sierra began working as an elder caregiver at 16, and by 21 had opened non-medical home care services to her community, growing those services to support hundreds of elders. She has dedicated over 3 decades to a more compassionate approach to aging and end of life, and is the heart behind Choose Nurture. I am really excited to see you and welcome you. I will also read the biography, and then we go and get into what you have to share. She's, as I mentioned already, an experienced elder caregiver and end-of-life doula. And she's also the founder of Choose Nurture. Sierra is the leading voice in end-of-life reform, and she combines her professional background with her personal journey as a cancer survivor to educate and support aging adults and their loved ones. So welcome, Sierra.
Thank you, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet you.
Why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about how you came into the field where you work, and also how that is connected to grief, loss, trauma?
Mm-hmm. I feel this service, this work finds us more than we go searching for it. I was really honored, blessed to be raised more by my grandmother. And I spent the majority of my summers with her, working on a farm in Middle America and taking care of all of our elders. She just naturally normalized death. It was part of life. And when someone was sick or especially dying, she would open up her house, put a hospital bed right in the middle of her living room, her salon. And as a child, we would watch cartoons while with an auntie or an uncle in their hospital bed. We were part of their entire journey. And so it was never hidden from myself as a child. And so I grew up in a world where I was surprised at how many other kids never talked about it. She normalized death, but my grandmother didn't really normalize grief and talking about it and the emotional aspects that come along with that. It was very much her way of life was of service and of duty. This is what the women in the family do. It was very much her identity. And my grief journey really started at 13 when I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And I went through 7, 8 very invasive treatments from 13 until 21. And it was in that journey where everyone was making decisions for me. And everyone was doing their best. My mother was doing her best. My father, they worked full time. But I remember distinctly sitting, looking at my gynecologist at 13, who was a man. And my first question was, why did you choose to do this work? Like, what are you doing here in this room? And I have to get naked again for you? This is not healing. This is the antithesis of healing for me as a teenage girl.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother's response was, just do anything that he says. And so we had this big conflict, and I felt myself really go inward. And luckily, I found my first job in a nursing home at 16, and I had 100 new grandparents that lived in this home. And I didn't have to tell them that I was going through cancer treatments, but they were a balm for my soul. And the very few that I did tell, they were completely different than how my mother responded. And it was everything that I needed. And that's when my journey with grief and understanding how someone can love you so much, like my own parents, but I felt they were making all of the wrong decisions. And yeah, so I went very deeply inward, but I found so much freedom in those friendships and those relationships that none of my peers were having.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, at 16, as you were just saying, that there's not a lot of people around a 16-year-old who are experienced with death or who even want to talk about that. That's a completely different area or place in life. What has death or relating to those elders taught you at the age that most other teenagers or adults still haven't learned?
Specifically, my time with elders who were all facing the end of their life, I actually thought I was facing the end of mine as well. Mm-hmm. Every statistic, all of these doctors were giving me really grim feedback. And I found a resonance that we were actually on a very similar journey. But I found the essence of what I call grandmother's heart. Just this deep well of compassion that you just want to fall into when life is giving you lemons, when you just don't know what to do. You want to go to grandmother's house. You want to have tea and cookies and just be in her presence. And that was my healing. And I realized, what is that really? It's this listening without judging. It's full presence. Grandma is nowhere else, and she can see so many layers of things that are happening without words. It's nonverbal and it's also verbal. But the essence really was compassion and finding that in other relationships. I would say patience is a very big one, and acceptance. Mm-hmm. They were less accepting, the elders in the nursing home, to the end of their life than I found I was at 16 years old.
How did that come about? What do you think?
It's a World War I and II generation. Mm-hmm. At that time. There was so much unresolved trauma, generational trauma. There's the statistic of like 1 in 4 women or something have experienced some type of harassment or abuse. Mm-hmm. I would say, while being bedside to hundreds of elders, mostly women, that number is a lot closer to 4 women. Mm-hmm. And there were so many stories that were in their body, that were in their being, that they needed to share. And I felt they had waited their whole life. And some of them, I don't think ever got to share that story, their story. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it was living in a culture where no one wanted to talk about it. No one knew how. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of unresolved family dynamics, even with elders in the nursing home. I would say especially those that were in a home, because many their family rarely visited. And really, when they did, it was very awkward. You could feel the family conflict around the bed.
So you mentioned a couple of things there, and especially those that I also feel are the most important ones to be with someone, for example, in grief and trauma, is to just be present and to ask questions. And it sounds like this is what you were at a very young age already able to just exhume to those people without any formal training, or just by who you were or how you experienced maybe that with your grandmother.
Yes, and also being a child, you know, even at 16, child, young adult, but many of them in some very playful way were becoming more childlike. I don't see elders as becoming children again, but many of them just had a playfulness about them where they were taking life a lot less seriously. But one thing we also really shared, it took me 1 or 2 years of working in the home until I realized they too didn't want to take a lot of Western medicine. They were really struggling with how many pills they were being given and how they had lost access to their primary care doctor. Once they went into the skilled nursing facility, there was a new doctor. Often that doctor manages all of the medication for the entire home. And that doctor never came to visit them. They only looked at their chart. And so when they would enter into the home, their medicines would change. Often they would be, in some cases, a little bit more sedated. And they were really pushing back. And so I found a place to have conversations around, I don't really want to take all of this medicine either. There must be a better way. And no one in my family wanted to have that conversation.
Wow. I mean, that sounds really intense. I mean, just from focusing on you as well, going through this illness at a very early age and not having the support from your family. How did you deal with that at the time?
I did have support. I had extreme Western medical support. Let's throw the Western kitchen sink at this. And unfortunately, that came with a lot of hormones. And, you know, being 13 when I had started them, it really, I think, for my own journey, it made the cancer more intense. Because 7 years later, I went from having cervical cancer to ovarian cancer. And I was questioning, and my body was telling me, this is not working. This doesn't feel right. Something's off. But everything I was told was just stay with the course. Studies are showing that this is what's effective. And by the time I could leave my parents' nest and make my own decisions, I did that very early. By 17, I went to college early. And a lot of this was because I wanted to have my own voice. And one of the first things I did was change my healthcare proxy away from my parents, which was devastating. And I sat on the other side of the grief, watching them and realizing I felt as though I had caused them harm, but there was something in me, my inner voice said, no, if you keep going this path with so much Western medicine, you might not make it. And so I was willing to have the hard conversations with my parents and also let go. I had to really find my own way. And they did give me a lot of support. It was just not at the time the support that I really felt I needed. And luckily at 18, I met a group of Tibetan Buddhist monks. I'm still very close with them. And they're in Bloomington, Indiana. And there was something, the very first teaching I went to, it was a meditation on compassion and the mother of compassion. And they started the meditation inviting us to imagine the love of a mother that's completely unconditional. You know, and they described this motherly love, and I could not stop crying. And, I raised my hand and I asked, is it possible that in Tibet, mothers are completely different than mothers here in the West? And at first, the monks kind of laughed, but then they realized, wow, there's trauma here. And how do we give the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, but also hold space for this dissonance? And they took me on a many decade journey now, and really finding that mother of compassion from within. And really, just the journey of being a mother or being a daughter. It's that has been one of my biggest journeys in grief.
So it probably wasn't specific in terms of the support that you missed. Wasn't the support in terms of medical care, but more so the appropriate care, or the support on an emotional, on a basis where they saw you for who you were and wanted to be there for you in the way that you needed it. So that wasn't specified.
Even to just stop and say, wow, this must be really hard for you as a teenager. I found that my mother went into hypervigilance of, if this will work, let's try it. And so she was hyper organizing everything. And it's interesting how when we look back at our lives, how we rebel or adapt, how we take on or rebel against how our own parents, how they brought us into this relationship with love. And there's so much beauty in organizing and being as organized as possible. But I absolutely rebelled against that as I grew into an adult.
Yeah. I was just imagining, as a mother of a 14-and-a-half-year-old, what would happen with me if she was facing what you faced at that time. And obviously I can't say because it's not here, but looking at it through the lens of the nervous system, I understand that some people would go into activation and be really doing and trying to organize everything, or being very vigilant, as you said. And others might just go into complete disassociation or shutdown or shock. And to be holding oneself in a hopefully regulated space, and to be asking and to go slow where possible, would be the third option. And luckily, I have a daughter who picks me up on that and tells me, Mom, what I need from you right now is, if I don't offer her what she needs. And then I'm very quickly realizing, okay, and I can take a step back. But yes, that's not possible for everyone. But maybe continue on your story as well a little bit, so people can understand what you went through. So you mentioned 20 or 22, the next step.
The next step for me was having a partial hysterectomy at 21. And luckily I had an incredible doctor who said, you've been through a lot. I think you should just roll the dice here. If you drink purified water, never drink or eat from plastic, eat organic. And I was 21 years old. This is in 2001 in Middle America. I found this doctor in Cincinnati, Ohio, Dr. Chung. And he had a book called Chunging, this kind of pamphlet that he'd created. He'd been in gynecology for 40 years. He came from Asia and wanted to be in medicine where pharmaceuticals were not as prevalent. And that's the path he chose. So he found himself in that field with 4 daughters. And he said, if you were my daughter, be as healthy as you can. And if this comes back, then you can do aggressive treatment. And I took that to heart. He suggested being vegetarian. I did that for 12 years after that surgery. And thankfully, I have been cancer-free. I also, from that journey, I started to volunteer with women going through cancer treatment. I started that while I was in my undergraduate And when I look back at it, I think I did that so I could understand what could be ahead. For me, it was the best way to learn about what was really happening. And most of these women were my mother's age, and they were going through reproductive or breast cancer. Many of them did not make it, but I got to really walk alongside them. I met dozens of women in my community that gave me so much strength and courage in my own path. And I found my people, my sisters, and my surrogate mothers in many ways. But I also started at that time, as I ended my undergraduate, I'd been taking care of a few elderly women in an assisted living home. And one of their daughters came to me and she was just said, "We don't want to lose you after college. And we would really love it, if you could stay on board. But I want you to build a business." She said, "I want to help you. I want you to just train women to do what you're doing," which was very simple. I would go into the assisted living home. I had, in my undergraduate, 3 elderly women, and every session we'd start with a foot soak, and we would talk about how to prevent falls. From everything from looking at their apartment and looking at clutter to their diet to active, isolated stretching and some yoga. And one thing, I had found yoga with meditation at 18, and we would do breath work. And that's when the stories, the trauma started to fly out of these women. And I found myself at their feet, literally doing reflexology and listening. And many of them, it was the first time they had ever shared the most painful, very deeply buried memories of their life. And they were facing also the end of their life, the last 2 to 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took that woman's advice. She's still a very dear friend of mine, and more than 25 years later. And that just grew very quickly. She said there are 3 assisted living homes in the community. If you just keep training more women, matching them, and we primarily offered 24/7 care. So we were mostly non-medical, and we would take them through the end, sometimes partnering with hospice. And again, I was very much healing my own wound of this feeling of walking through the world motherless in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And every one of these women just filled my life with so much joy. And one thing about this work is there's this immediate sense of family. And I had that with not just dozens, but over 15 years, hundreds of families. And I'm at this point now where I'm 3 generations. So in some families, I've been the death doula for 3 generations.
Wow.
And it's a great honor. And so for me, leaving my family quite young, I found so much family in the world. And I wasn't necessarily looking for that consciously. It was all deeply unconscious. And I was just like I had taken that same skill of my mother instilled in me, and I was organizing their lives, their medical, all the elements of their lives. And I didn't really understand how deeply they were helping heal me.
Mm. So it's interesting what you mentioned here about the influence of your mother, what she instilled in you, and how you carried that forward in caring for those elders, in a way also mothering them at the end of their life.
Yes. Yes. And that's been my path of being a mother. And I would say that's, those are the layers of grief of not being able to have my own children.
Mm-hmm.
That really, those layers of grief came up more in my 40s.
Mm-hmm.
I started to not miss having my own children, but I never had anyone, even a therapist, speak with me about that and really just sit with that. The ability to have my own children was, in essence, a gift that was never given to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, I think, hid hid that grief or tucked it away until I could look back. And I took a break from taking care of so many people after 15 years. And that's when I realized, wow, that was so healing. And yet I still have to sit with that grief, and accept I have absolutely been mothering to so many grandmothers.
Mhm.
And some people say mothering is mothering, but I think it's very different. I think when someone has their own children, it's the ultimate spiritual path to me. Parenting looks like the ultimate human experience in so many ways. You know, it comes with so much challenge and so much love. And you have a daughter.
Mhm.
The constant reflection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes with all that you just mentioned. A lot of challenge, a lot of love, a lot of everything, and being mirrored. I mean, I have a quite emotionally mature daughter, probably doesn't fall far from the tree. And yeah, she's constantly already at her age giving me a mirror. So you mentioned I still have to sit with that grief, and you mentioned in your 40s, which is obviously now. So how does that sit with you right now? How do you sit with your grief?
I have to slow down and stop taking care of others.
Mm-hmm.
That's in the Enneagram, I'm a solid 2. And it's just so ingrained in me. And it's ingrained from many generations of women in my family on both maternal and paternal side. So it means for me a lot of time in nature, um, seeking support specifically from grief therapists.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I've been 30 years at the bedside of the dying, I still recommend with families I work with to see a grief therapist. There's
Absolutely.
a very big difference in the work that I'm doing and what I've been exposed to. And then the research and understanding of grief and its impact on our nervous system, on our memory, on our body. And so that has been challenging because I feel my resistance. I feel wow, do I really want to spend 200 on a session? Do I really need that? Is it necessary? And it's an investment that's always worth making,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a therapy or a workshop. And the next for me are workshops that focus on grief. Because for many years, I thought I would be there to learn because I don't have as significant of losses as a lot of people who go to retreats specifically for grief, like the loss of a spouse or a child. And I haven't experienced that. But in the last 5 years, it's caught up with me where I realized, no, actually, just having that ability to have my own children um, taken from me at such a young age.
Mm. And so many places with grief are not death related, right?
Yeah.
So, one of the things I'm also interested in is that, I mean, you've said with hundreds of people at the end of their lives, and is there something besides what we know from Tuesdays with Maury or other people who have spoken about that? What is your experience? What people grieve most, like from their life, or from maybe not their death, but in their life? What do they miss that they haven't maybe done or experienced?
People miss most that they didn't fully live. And I feel that when we normalize these conversations on death, we actually start living more. We can identify more with what our fears are and why we're hesitant or resisting certain aspects of life that we're meant to be living more of. So that is the biggest one. They look at places where they stayed small,
Mm-hmm.
where they kept the stories inside, because these women who shared heart-wrenching trauma that they'd never shared with anyone before, they looked like they shed 10 pounds. There was so much more light coming out of their eyes. They had more freedom in their joints. Their hips hurt less. It was clear to me at a very young age, all of this we're holding in our body. And so those moments taught me whatever we can do to learn how to surrender and let go, we're actually learning how to live more, to be more present. And the other thing is just communication. A lot of women shared with me, and elderly men, especially those who'd been at war, just how when they look back, they realize they didn't have the skills. And what I talk about now with families is that we live in the digital age. You can find very quickly courses, resources on how to become a better communicator of your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that more men, they would realize as they were more confined to their bed or confined with less mobility, that they didn't communicate with their sons or their children how they really felt.
So one of the things I've also been wondering is, given the people that I work with or the people that are listening here, from your experience, if a family hasn't been prepared for the death of their loved one, what have you experienced? Or, what specifically is important for those people to know and understand in regards to the dying process or in regards to the person who died?
Specifically, let's take this in two pathways. One would be sudden death.
Mm-hmm.
We were never meant to grieve alone, right? This is a collective experience. And this is why in indigenous cultures and throughout history, people that were grieving were not left alone.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big one that we're losing as we lose the village, this kind of village-like life. And we have to work against that resistance, I feel, in life now, and really think of how, as we age more in community and less in isolation. And yes, we could boil it down to simply say we need to reach out more, but that's not enough. It's that those of us that are capable and we know that our loved ones, our friends, our neighbor, the woman at the grocery store, the person, the teacher at the school, and we know that they've had a significant loss, that's our role to step in and be a better villager.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that could look like inviting them out, taking a walk, and then knowing that it's just your presence. It's just extending the invite. And if you feel really nervous about saying the wrong thing, because a lot of us, I've done it myself. I've stuck my own foot in my mouth of saying the wrong thing, like it will get better, or, they're in less pain now. These kinds of things that we might feel compelled to say, but we don't have to say anything. If you just invite someone for dinner or a walk and they're grieving, just your presence, the silence can be the balm for their soul.
Mm.
And then we have preparation when we have time. But we know, there is anticipatory grief. And those of us with aging parents, aging loved ones, or even aging ourselves, there is this anticipatory grief of that one day our person is not going to be with us in their body. And acknowledging that and just saying, and what I also wanted to say, if you feel like you're going to say something wrong to someone grieving, it's so helpful to say, I know I'm probably going to say the wrong thing. I just want to apologize ahead of time, but thank you for taking the invite and being here. But with our aging loved ones, this anticipatory grief could be years. Mm-hmm. It could even be decades. And for those of us who've taken care of our loved ones and watched them go through chronic illness, getting better, going through a roller coaster, it's an exhausting process. And even then, a lot of families are not prepared, even though they could be in a caregiving dynamic for 10 to 20 years. And so what does it look like to be prepared? I find that the best way to learn about the stages of dying, what to expect, is to volunteer in hospice. And even though I've been in this work 30 years and I've moved, I had to get out of small town Indiana by my 30s. And so I've lived in San Francisco and in New York. I live in Spain now. Every place I have ever lived, I volunteer for hospice. I meet the most extraordinary people, all different walks of life. New York blew my mind with the visiting nurse services. They serve 65,000 people in New York a year. And the volunteers there were 30 to 40 in each class, and they were coming from all over the world with such different backgrounds, and some coming from absolute refugees, and some were investment bankers. And here we were all in this room learning about this one thing we're all going to experience. And we're all going to be given the gift of coming alongside someone that we love. And most people in that hospice environment, in the trainings, had experienced a loss and they did not know what to do. And they were so traumatized by not knowing. Mm-hmm. And even if they gave their loved ones the most amazing, they did their all, they would come into that door, into the hospice trainings, feeling like there was not enough. Mm-hmm. And I saw them, and usually the trainings are 2 days. And when they walked out, they had a whole community of people. They had been given so much reassurance that everything that they had done was more than enough. Mm-hmm. And that's the number one way. Not all of us have the time or the capacity to volunteer, but services in hospice, volunteer services, hospitals, they exist all over the world. And I'm really amazed by that, that even in remote areas, there's often a free hospice program to learn about and come alongside other people in your community. And it can be so much easier when it's not someone that you adore and love.
Yeah. I think you said the key word there in terms of being prepared, because from listening to you and my understanding is with clients and family members is you're never really prepared. You cannot be prepared. Even in the face of my daughter's death, where we knew that her life wasn't sustainable, or that's what we were told, even though we had hope, you are still not prepared for that moment when the soul passes. I would say the same way we are not prepared as women to give birth. Yes, we do all these courses because it's something that we want to do, hopefully. But still, when the birth comes, it shows up the way it shows up, and you can't really prepare for that. It's not something that you go through once and then next time it's going to be the same. However, one thing you also said about preparing in terms of being with other people at the end of life. And one of the things I wanted to share with you was that actually I had this fascination with death and dying and grief for a long time, which I didn't realize until my own significant death. But actually, one of the ways that I prepared or looked at it in myself, which was suggested by my Buddhist psychotherapist at the time, was to do this practice called A Year to Live by Stephen Levine, or Levine, however it's pronounced. And that's the time when we still bought books. I'm holding it up here. I'm going to put it in the show notes. And it actually gives very specific things to do each month. So to imagine that within a year, you're going to die and you do certain things. And I was quite young at the time to do this, but I followed his suggestion, and it was really interesting to see what that did within me, to consciously think about those things and talk about those things and have these experiences. And also, we as a species, we sort of avoid death in the sense, and actually I read this about the research that they've done, that they showed people pictures where some of the pictures had a significance in terms of them themselves with death. So, for example, them at a grave or them within the grave, and they did scans on the brain, I think, and they actually could show that the people, when they were faced with pictures of themselves related to death, they would disengage. So it was as if the brain was saying, "No, it's not about me." And as far as I remember the research, it was saying that we have a way that we divert any attention of ourselves relating to death. Yet, when you have experienced a close loved one die, then obviously this doesn't work in the same way. So then and that's how I feel. I actually say I have become friends with death, because for me and going back to the death of my daughter, it was the most awe-filled moment in my life. At the same time, the most painful, but that awe is there too. And so, yeah, I wanted to ask you, having been present with so many people who died, tell us about your experience. How do you experience that? What do you feel and see? And
I'll share one of my first experiences really shocked me. I was in the nursing home at 16, and I became fascinated in visiting patients who were completely bedbound and being fed through a tube. When I learned that no one was visiting them, they would go weeks or months. They would be bathed. That would be their visit. And I didn't shy away from that. So I would take a book, and often I found myself just sitting with them in silence. And there was a woman, when I walked in the room, she sat up. And this is someone who'd been bedbound for months, maybe years. And when you work in hospice or you're present for the very end, this is common, that someone will have this big jolt of energy. And my first inclination was to get a nurse. Like, something's wrong, that she should be in bed, she should be out. And I paused, and she gasped for breath, and she was in active dying. I just happened to walk in the room at that moment, and the sound of her breath was so primal. I'd never heard anything like that. It was a deep heaving, and then it would be 30 seconds of silence, and I felt frozen. And I went through my mind, the nurse, I should get someone. But instead, I sat down in the chair by her bed. And then I decided to come closer to her and touch her. And I just said, "It's okay." I feel like there's a blueprint in us, just like for women giving birth. There's something, even though we might not be prepared, the body knows how to do that. Not only did I feel in that moment, her body and her nervous system knew it's okay, but I knew to stay calm, to not go get the nurse, to not make a big scene of this, but to just be present. And when I was really present, I feel I was really with her blueprint of, okay, let's do this peacefully. And she went from this holding on, because I also feel in those moments, people are so susceptible to the energy in the room.
mm-hmm.
So when I was frozen and in a state of fear, thinking I needed the nurse, she was experiencing that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I calmed down, she went so peacefully. It was just this like melting. And then, of course, I experienced many other kinds of more dramatic, families arguing around the table. And I could just see how the person passing was like a sponge. And that's when, again, maybe I can attribute this to my mother and her organization and being somewhat domineering in decision making. I found myself, even in my late teenage years, telling the family, enough, let's just all be on the same page that our goal here is to have a peaceful environment around the bed. And everyone would listen. No one would argue with that, and then they might congregate again and find themselves, because there were many siblings who hadn't spoken in decades. And here they were kind of forced into an institutional care environment around the bed of their parent and arguing out loud. So I would just come in and remind them, how can we make this more peaceful? And everyone would respond. And that's where I feel death is our greatest teacher. It really, in those moments, even when these 2 or 3 or 4 adults that were all siblings were fighting horribly, they could just be an adult and put it aside and be present with what was really happening. And I would often say to families in great conflict, this seems like a portal for healing for your family, and this huge opportunity to let all of what has been binding you in anger and your grief over not being connected all of these years, to just let it go without needing an apology, without needing the other person to change. What would that look like? And I found that in those moments where there was such great loss, they could react without as much reactivity, but they needed to have an anchor of peace in that environment to do it.
Yeah. This is the first part of a 2-part series with Sierra Campbell. You've just listened to the first half of my interview with Sierra, which was so interesting that we actually went much longer than the usual episode that you're listening to. So episode number 189 is the second part of our conversation. So head over to 189 and continue listening. Enjoy. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.